On the night of October 27, 1922, 30,000 men are marching on Rome. Their leader is in Milan at the theatre. When word arrives that the king will receive him, he goes to the station. He arrives the following morning and is appointed Prime Minister of Italy before lunchtime. 3 years earlier, his enemies had staged a mock funeral for him in the streets of the same city. In the summer of 1919, a crowd occupied Florence for a day. They had broken into warehouses, taken what was inside, and held the city until government forces moved them on. It was one of dozens of such incidents that summer: bread riots, land seizures, factory takeovers, spreading from the industrial north to the rural south. The government announced measures to ease the food shortage and returned most cities to a kind of order within weeks. What nobody announced was what had made the riots possible, or what people who started them were supposed to do now. Italy had entered the First World War in 1915 under a secret treaty. The Treaty of London promised the new kingdom substantial territorial gains, parts of Dalmatia, the Adriatic coast, a piece of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, in exchange for fighting on the Allied side. The promise was made in private by men who did not consult the Italian people, and it rested on the assumption that the war would be short and the Allies generous. Both assumptions were wrong. By the time the guns stopped, 651,000 Italian soldiers were dead. Another 589,000 civilians had perished from disease and hunger. The lira was worth 1/6 of its pre-war value. And then Italy went to Versailles. The British and French, who had promised the territory and now found it inconvenient to give it, offered what amounted to polite regret. Italy received Trentino and Trieste, but not the Dalmatian coast, not the African colonies it had been led to expect, not the Mediterranean influence its leaders had spent 4 years of blood purchasing. The Italian delegation walked out of the conference. The poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, nationalist provocateur, incapable of silence, gave the humiliation a name that would define Italian politics for the next decade: Vittoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory. In September 1919, D'Annunzio did not stop at naming it. He led 2,600 irregulars to seize the port city of Fiume, which had been denied to Italy at the peace conference, and held it for 15 months while the Italian government stood by and did nothing of consequence. For many Italians, this was the clearest possible signal. Their leaders were not merely incompetent, they were incapable of defending the country's honor, and a poet with a private army had more backbone than the men in Rome. The political establishment in Rome was not, to be fair, short of problems. Inflation was eating the savings of every middle-class family in the country, and from the industrial north, something was rising that frightened them far more than D'Annunzio. Between 1919 and 20, workers occupied factories across Turin, Milan, and the northern industrial belt. Peasants in the south seized land. Socialist trade unions reached 2 million members. In September 1920, around 400,000 workers occupied factories in a coordinated action, attempting to run them without their owners. The Italian Socialist Party had grown from 24,000 members before the war to over 200,000 by 1920. Property owners, industrialists, agrarian landowners, the frightened middle classes looked at what was happening in their fields and factories and looked at what had happened in Russia 3 years earlier. They were not wrong to be afraid. What they needed was someone to be afraid on their behalf. On March 23, 1919, Mussolini convened approximately 200 people in an office at Piazza San Sepolcro in Milan. Discharged soldiers who had come home to nothing, radical syndicalists, disaffected Republicans, men with energy and no direction. He called the movement the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Italian combat squads, and took the name from the ancient Roman fasces, the bundle of rods that symbolized strength through unity. The symbolism was deliberate, not a new idea, but the oldest Italian idea there was, dressed for the present moment. In November 1919, the movement received 2,420 votes. His enemies paraded a coffin with his name on it through the streets of Milan. The socialist paper ran a gleeful obituary. What nobody noticed, or nobody chose to act on, was that the fear in the country, which the socialists had created and then failed to convert into power, was still there, still looking for somewhere to go. Mussolini had lost the election, he had not lost the country. The factory occupations of September 1920 ended not with a revolution, but with a negotiated settlement. The workers had held the plants for about 3 weeks. Then the raw materials ran out, the engineers sided with the owners, and the money dried up. The Italian Socialist Party accepted a compromise and declared the crisis over. For the propertied classes who had spent 3 weeks convinced they were about to lose everything, it was not over. It was a warning. The state had not protected them. They were in the market for someone who would. What that market produced was the squadristi, agrarian capitalists in the Po Valley, where agricultural unions were strongest, began funding paramilitary groups to do what the police would not: break the unions, evict the socialist councils, and burn the cooperatives the left had spent years building. The Blackshirts obliged. They drove through the countryside in trucks, destroyed union halls and left-wing newspapers, beat organizers, and replaced elected socialist mayors with men willing to work with the movement. The local fascist bosses who took control of rural areas became known as the Ras, a term borrowed from Ethiopian provincial governors, which tells you something about how they understood their own authority. What is less often remembered is that this met organized resistance. In 1921, a coalition of anarchists, communists, republicans, syndicalists, and some socialists formed the Arditi del Popolo, the People's Daring Ones. They were not a marginal fringe. At their peak, they numbered in the tens of thousands, and in several cities, they gave the Blackshirts serious trouble. In Parma, in the summer of 1922, a working-class neighborhood called the Alto Torrente held off a Blackshirt force many times its size for 4 days behind improvised barricades, with weapons scrounged from wherever they could find them. The street fighting was real, and the outcome was not inevitable. But the Italian Socialist Party, whose members the Arditi del Popolo were largely trying to defend, formally disavowed the organization and instructed its members not to join. The reasoning was partly doctrinal, partly an abiding belief that fascism was a passing phase that would burn itself out without needing to be fought. The Communist Party, newly split from the Socialists, was similarly dismissive. So the one force that might have physically stopped the Blackshirt advance in the countryside was left without the backing of the organizations it was trying to protect, and it withered. Mussolini watched all of this from 2 positions at once. For the squadristi and the provincial fascist bosses, he was the symbol of a movement dismantling the left. For the conservative establishment in Rome, the liberal politicians, the industrialists, the church, the palace, he was presenting himself as a responsible nationalist who could be brought into government and managed. He had entered the Chamber of Deputies in 1921 with 35 seats. He made speeches about legality. He talked about order. Giovanni Gialotti, one of the most experienced operators in Italian parliamentary history, brought Mussolini's party into a national electoral coalition in 1921. The fascist movement, he decided, could be domesticated. In October 1922, Mussolini called his moment. At a rally in Naples on October 24th, he told the crowd that if the government would not hand over power, they would march on Rome and take it. 4 days later, on the night of October 27th-28th, approximately 30,000 Blackshirts began converging on the capital from multiple directions. Prime Minister Luigi Facta requested martial law. King Victor Emmanuel III, who had the constitutional authority to sign the order, had the army to enforce it, and whose generals had privately confirmed the march could be dispersed, refused. By refusing to sign, the king had handed the decision to whoever filled the vacuum. He invited Mussolini to Rome to form a government. Mussolini did not march with his men. He had spent the night in Milan, near the Swiss border, in a position from which he could have escaped if the gamble had failed. When the telegram arrived confirming the king's invitation, he went to the station. On October 31st, 1922, at 39 years old, he became the youngest prime minister in Italian history. He arrived at the palace still wearing his black shirt and then presented the king with a cabinet list in which the majority of the members were not even members of the fascist party. The conservatives who had helped him to the door relaxed. They thought they had hired a useful instrument. What they had actually done was give the key to someone who had been studying the lock for years. For the first 2 years, it was almost convincing. Mussolini governed in coalition. He kept non-fascist ministers in key posts. He gave speeches about national unity and made a point of being seen at church. The international press, which had spent the Biennio Rosso worrying about a Bolshevik Italy, looked at the new prime minister and used a word that will sound familiar to anyone paying attention to politics a century later. They called it the return to normalcy. The New York Times framed fascism as the restoration of order in a country that had lost its footing. Industrialists were reassured. The Vatican was cautiously supportive. The liberal politicians who had maneuvered him into office told each other they had made the right call. What was happening in the provinces told a different story. The squadristi had not been demobilized. The violence that had brought Mussolini to power had not stopped when he entered the palace. It had simply been reoriented. Opposition newspapers were raided, local officials who resisted fascist authority were replaced. But in Rome, in the Chamber of Deputies, in the drawing rooms where Italy's establishment made its decisions, there was a powerful incentive to look elsewhere. Mussolini was useful, he was governing, he was holding back the left. The costs, so far, appeared to be someone else's problem. The first test of this arrangement came in 1923 with the Acerbo Law. The existing electoral system used proportional representation, which produced fragmented parliaments and fragile coalitions. The very instability that made Mussolini's rise possible, and which he now intended to make permanent for everyone else. The Acerbo law replaced proportional representation with a system that guaranteed any party receiving more than 25% of the vote would receive 2/3 of the seats in the chamber. It passed with the support of the Conservative and Liberal parties whose members had persuaded themselves that a stable fascist government was preferable to continued chaos. They had just voted to make their own future irrelevance almost mathematically inevitable. The 1924 elections produced the result that the law was designed to produce. Under conditions of intimidation, fraud, and the systematic disruption of opposition campaigns, the fascists and their allies received 66% of the vote. Mussolini now controlled the chamber. He had arrived at power through the door the Conservatives held open, and he had no further need for them. There was one man in the chamber who had understood this earlier than anyone, and who had been saying so in print in public on the floor of Parliament for 3 years. Giacomo Matteotti was the leader of the Unitary Socialist Party, a deputy from the Po Valley who had been documenting fascist violence since 1921. He had published a book, The Fascisti Exposed, that catalogued the fraud and brutality of the movement in meticulous, evidenced detail, and had arranged for it to be translated and distributed abroad. He was 40 years old, precise, fearless, and apparently incapable of the strategic silence that kept most of his colleagues alive. On May 30, 1924, 10 days after the election, Matteotti rose in the chamber to denounce the results. He was heckled throughout by fascist deputies. He named names, cited incidents, demanded the election be annulled. When he finally sat down, he reportedly turned to a colleague and said something to the effect that he had delivered his speech, now they could prepare his funeral. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. On June 10, 1924, Matteotti left his apartment on the banks of the Tiber for his morning walk. Men were waiting for him. He was forced into the back of a car, and although witnesses noted the registration number and an investigation began almost immediately, his body would not be found until August, in a field outside Rome. He had been stabbed multiple times. The men who carried out the abduction were members of Mussolini's personal political police. Whether the order came to kill him directly from Mussolini remains disputed by historians. Recent research strongly suggests it did, connected to Matteotti's possession of evidence of a corrupt oil concession deal involving Mussolini's inner circle. But on the question of moral responsibility, the historical record is not genuinely ambiguous. The men who acted believed they were doing what their leader wanted. The leader had created the conditions in which that belief was reasonable. The reaction was the closest Italy ever came to stopping fascism from within. Fascist party badges disappeared from lapels across the country almost overnight. Mussolini's office, usually crowded with petitioners and allies, stood empty. Prominent liberals who had been cautiously supportive switched to open opposition. The Holy See, which had been quietly accommodating, fell silent. The conservative establishment that had installed Mussolini began, for the first time, to genuinely consider removing him. What the opposition did with this moment is one of the greatest strategic failures of 20th century politics. Approximately 130 deputies, socialists, liberals, the Catholic People's Party, Republicans, communists, walked out of the chamber in protest and refused to return until Mussolini had been held to account. They called it the Aventine succession, after the ancient Roman precedent of plebeians withdrawing from public life as an act of moral protest. Their strategy was to create a visible vacuum around the regime, to demonstrate its illegitimacy so clearly that the king will be forced to dismiss Mussolini from office. Antonio Gramsci, one of the founders of the Communist Party, argued from within the chamber that the secessionists were making a catastrophic error. Withdrawing from parliament, he said, was not pressure, it was a gift. It left Mussolini's fascists as the only party physically present in the chamber, free to pass whatever legislation they chose, while their opponents stood outside making speeches about morality. His proposal was that the Aventinian deputies form an anti-parliament, a counter-institution that would claim democratic legitimacy and force a genuine confrontation. The proposal was rejected. The Aventinians waited instead for the king. The king did not move. On New Year's Eve 1924, Mussolini's own party bosses gave him an ultimatum that settled what he had been hesitating over. Either crush the opposition yourself, they told him, or we will do it without you. He had been genuinely shaken by the Matteotti crisis, more than he would ever admit, but he understood that paralysis was more dangerous than aggression. On January 3, 1925, he stood before the chamber and delivered a speech that has no real parallel in the political history of democracies. He took full responsibility for everything the fascist movement had done. Every act of violence, every intimidation, every outrage his opponents had catalogued, he claimed it, named himself its author, and dared anyone in the room to prosecute him for it. Nobody moved. The conservatives in the chamber who might have acted sat in their seats. The opposition was outside. The king remained in his palace. The moment passed, and it did not come again. Matteotti had seen what was coming and said so, and they had prepared his funeral as he predicted. What nobody had prepared for was their own. After the January 3rd speech, Mussolini moved with deliberateness that made clear that he had been planning this for some time. By the end of 1925, the independent press had been shuttered or brought under fascist control. By 1926, all political parties except the PNF had been dissolved, free trade unions abolished, and local elected governments replaced with state-appointed administrators. In November 1926, a sweep of arrests followed emergency powers. Among those taken that night was Antonio Gramsci, the man who had argued from within the chamber that the Aventinian withdrawal would be a gift to Mussolini. He would spend the next 9 years in prison, writing what would become some of the most important political philosophy of the century, and dying in 1937, released only when he was too ill to be a threat. A special tribunal for the defense of the state eventually imprisoned more than 5,000 people. For most Italians, especially outside the political class, none of this felt like catastrophe. The changes came one at a time, and each one was small enough to live with. Children enrolled in the Opera Nazionale Ballia from age 6 were learning loyalty to the Duce as a school subject, but they were also going on camping trips and playing sport. The public works programs, the draining of the Pontine marshes, the building of roads and railways were visible and tangible. The trains, as the saying went, ran on time. It was not true in any systematic way, but the fact that it was believed tells you something real about what the regime was selling and why so many people chose to buy it. Women's experience of this bargain was its own contradiction. The official ideology was blunt. Women existed to bear children for the nation. Family planning information was banned in 1927. Women were pushed back to the domestic sphere and offered cash prizes for bearing 7 or more children. And yet the regime simultaneously built an extensive network of maternity clinics and women's organizations, not out of generosity, but because it needed compliance, and understood that compliance required reciprocity. For the women who had worked in factories during the war, who had begun to move through public life in ways their mothers had not, fascism represented the closing of a door that had only just managed to open. Meanwhile, the regime was being watched. Hitler had attempted his own version of the March on Rome in November 1923, the beer hall putsch in Munich, directly modelled on what Mussolini had done the year before, and had failed, ending up in prison. He did not stop watching. From the late 1920s, Mussolini provided financial support to the Nazi Party and allowed SS and SA men to train alongside his Blackshirts. When Hitler finally came to power in January 1933, Mussolini had been governing Italy for 11 years. He had the dictatorship fully assembled, the press controlled, the opposition imprisoned, the institutions hollowed out, and had done it through elections and emergency decrees and the patient exploitation of people who kept believing he could be managed. Hitler had studied all of it. The international press called fascism a restoration of order. Most governments found Mussolini a useful partner. The violence, the prisoners, the slow extinction of public life, these were present in the record for anyone who wanted to find them. Most did not look very hard. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more stories about how power is won and lost, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which chapter of history we should cover next.